Thank you. Geopolitics is a reasonably exciting time for all of us involved in that field. And I think for India right now, as is true for many other, should we say, middle powers, the difficulties we face right now are that India's always had a reasonably hostile relationship with China, one superpower. We now have an extremely difficult relationship, though not necessarily a hostile one, but at least a transactional one with the United States. So how exactly does India handle this, and how do other parts of the world see these problems is why we're here. So let me begin with Michael, since he's the American in the room. So why don't we begin with you and ask you, where do you see the US going, and where do you think India, how should India be responding to this?
Yeah, so I would say these days being an American in Washington doesn't necessarily mean that one can get a good pulse in terms of what's going on, because it's very difficult to predict the current administration. But I would make one top-line comment here. I think that what we've seen with the second Trump administration is that it has taken what I would describe as an aggressively transactional and commercial approach to foreign policy on the whole, much more so than what we saw with the first Trump administration. And this is something that has implications for India. And basically what I mean here is that trade is the core lens through which the administration sees its diplomatic relations. And that means that its first consideration is going to be, what is this country doing that could undercut or threaten U.S. economic interests? And tariffs is a trade imbalance that does not in America's favor is going to be a concern. And of course, with India, we know that President Trump has always expressed concerns about Indian tariffs. You know, this is not new. We haven't only been hearing this in recent weeks and recent months. And so India came into the crosshairs. And if we look at how the U.S.-India relationship reached a point of crisis, I think we have to start at the fact that the Trump administration has singled out India as a core offender when it comes to those countries that have economic policies that can undercut America's own economic interests. And as we've gone through the first few months of this second Trump administration, I would argue as well that the administration has seen the way in which India has gone about its interactions with the Trump administration as something that's concerning. And that includes not making as many concessions as the administration would have liked to see it make in trade negotiations. And so that certainly has had an impact on the relationship as well. In terms of moving forward, how should India look at the situation? I would just make one comment here that we need to distinguish between what we've been seeing and hearing from the White House when it comes to India and what we've been seeing and hearing when it comes to other areas of the U.S. government. I would argue that generally speaking in D.C., there's a continued desire to work with India, a view that India continues to be a strategic partner. And I think that we could see things settle down in due course. But I think one question moving forward, and I'll end here, is will those not in the White House be able to carve out the agency and the policy space to drive policy toward India? I think if that starts to happen, we'll start to see some of these tensions in the relationship calm down a bit.
So just quickly on the follow on. So what you seem to be indicating is that the heart of the problem is just a trade deal, and that's Trump's personal obsession. If we get the trade deal done, do you see a correction in the relationship?
I think that'll help. I think that would be a confidence-building measure for sure. But, you know, we have to keep in mind here that the two countries have continued to work together despite all of the tensions. And I think that if we look at media coverage and we look at the broader debate, the focus is on the tensions, because this relationship had seemingly been in such a good place for so long. But, you know, there was a defense framework agreement that was announced just a few weeks ago. And the two countries have continued to work together on defense. There have continued to be military exercises. You know, the two countries launched a joint satellite not that long ago. So, you know, beyond the headlines, so to speak, you know, they have continued to work together. But I would argue that at the end of the day, the Trump administration squandered a fair amount of trust and goodwill here based on the messaging, the policies, the rhetoric that was not received well here. And I think that the onus, quite frankly, might be on the U.S. to try to do what needs to be done to win back some of that goodwill. And a trade deal itself would be helpful, but would not necessarily be everything that's needed.
Right. So, Dr. Sullivan, so you are going to represent Europe here. Your name represents three parts of Europe, as far as I can see. You've just seen Vladimir Putin come when the red carpet rolled out for him. Normally, that's a bit of a red flag, especially for Europe. Not so much for Washington right now. But we're going to be seeing Ursula von der Leyen coming as a Republic Day guest in just next month, and probably Chancellor Merz, Macron, and other European leaders coming in February and March. So how do you see India argues that it needs to maintain a relationship with Russia, especially in fact, at a time when its problems with China and the U.S. are where they are. How do you see this playing out, especially as far as Europe is concerned?
So in a way, the loss of trust, I think, between India and the United States is a sort of a win for Europe, you could argue. I think the two groups, the EU in particular, has a lot that it can do with India. I mean, there's a great trade relationship, perhaps, in the offing. The two can cooperate on biotech, renewables, quantum computing. There are opportunities there. And I think both of them are in a moment where they're sort of hedging. They both have their unique issues with China and are facing an increasingly unreliable partner in the United States. So this looks quite rosy. The problem with Europe and India, of course, though, is that the EU tends to approach agreements with partners in a way that goes beyond, for example, trade policy. It goes beyond just pure trade. There are these sort of expectations of agreements on the side that reach into things like climate protection, social protections, and these feel actually, in a way, protectionist, I think, from an Indian point of view. I mean, your Minister of External Affairs has said that Europe is one of the, or the EU is one of the hardest trade partners because it doesn't just seek to regulate trade. Other things come into play. So there are obstacles on that side. And then, of course, the Russia piece. I think it's definitely the case that from an EU perspective, there's been sort of a real hope that India might understand more how much Russia represents an existential threat. And this has been ramping up over the last sort of few months. And it's increasingly about more and more than just Ukraine. It's about concerns more generally that Russia seeks to destabilize a sort of rules-based order. So, you know, there's potential, but of course there are things that cause frictions, I think, between both sides.
But what we are seeing, though, for example, with the FTA that you've mentioned, 16 years India and EU tried to get an FTA. And as you said, the huge number of, should we say, non-trade issues that the EU brought in basically meant the Indians gave up on this. But now we saw an agreement with the European Free Trade Association come through quite rapidly. We saw one of the UK come through. And from what I understand, the present FTA negotiations with Europe, if there's any reason why they have a good chance of being completed by January, is because a lot of these non-trade issues have just been dropped. And that's, seems to be a geopolitically driven pragmatism on Brussels. And so on that one front, and then on top of that, we've seen, for example, when Putin came in, we saw three key European ambassadors write a joint op-ed and say not so much that they were not less about being critical of India, but saying we hope, given that Modi meets and gets to talk with Putin on a level we don't, that he tells them that the war in Ukraine is something that has to come to an end. So again, extremely pragmatic approach to how this works. So the question for me is really let's assume we get an FTA done in January. Where does the European relationship with India go next?
So I absolutely agree that I think one of the things we saw with the UK-India trade agreement was that in the process of negotiating that, the two sides came to know each other a lot better and one another's sensitivities. And I think we're seeing the same thing with the India-EU trade deal. The question, I suppose, is where next? I see a difference, actually, between, I mean, let's pan out and look at a wider story. For me, there's a big compatibility in some respects, or there has been, between what the US seeks in its partnership with India and what India has sought in its partnership with the US, right? So the US has wanted to assist India in becoming this sort of balancing pole in Asia, and India has wanted to build out its own strategic autonomy, its own sort of material capability as a pole. And this is, I think, very much centered on India's aspirations for a multipolar order and to be a significant pole in that order. Now, longer term, that actually, I think, contradicts what the United States hopes for, which is continued US primacy. And I think that's where the story with Europe is a bit different, because I think Europe understands that this is not going to be a future order in which, you know, one power or two powers prevail. I think they also accept that things are shifting very rapidly, and maybe are on the same page there. But maybe Russia takes it one step further, because I think at the Valdai Club in October, Putin said, you know, this is a really, we were already seeing a multipolar order, foreign policy has become very flexible, there's space for creativity. And I think this opening up and this shifting landscape is perhaps something that India identifies with even more, from my reading and my understanding. So I think there's a sort of, each partner has its longer term sort of contradictions, maybe semi-consensus, and maybe enabling role. And we're seeing those three things play out all at once.
So, Mike, I'll turn back to you. I know one of the countries that you are specialized in is one that is a constant irritant in India, which is Pakistan. So we've seen a couple of unusual developments with Pakistan, or maybe not so unusual. One is the military effectively have come back to power and taken over one more time. We saw India and Pakistan go through their 4-year itch of having a battle with each other. But we've also seen a very peculiar relationship develop between Pakistan and, should we say, President Trump rather than his administration. How should we read the dynamics right now at Pakistan, and how would you read how Pakistan is reading what's happening with the United States and with, of course, its continuing relationship with China, and maybe a little bit about their rapidly deteriorating relationship with Afghanistan?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. So, yeah, I mean, for me, there are two key top-line trends in Pakistan right now. One you've alluded to, you know, the unbridled power of the military, and specifically the army chief. And, you know, one could argue, okay, maybe this is just a continuation of an ongoing trend where the military always dominates and has power, which is true. But, you know, I don't think we've ever seen in Pakistan a period of putative civilian rule where the army had the level of control and power that it has now. And what's also a bit different about this now compared to previous times is that significant numbers of the public in Pakistan don't like this. They're not happy with the military taking on the level of power that it has. And I think that's in part due to the Imran Khan effect, which has played out over the last few years, where we've seen rising levels of anti-army sentiment along the lines that we have not seen for quite some time. And, you know, I think that over the longer term, that might have some potential implications for social stability in Pakistan, right? Given the current state, it's not possible to mobilize and take to the streets and peacefully protest the military's level of power. But you have a lot of people, particularly young people in Pakistan, who are very unhappy about the current state of affairs. So that's one top-line trend. The other top-line trend I'd highlight is this resurgence in terrorism. We've seen an uptick in attacks over the last few years. You know, generally speaking, they've been mainly in the western regions of the country near Afghanistan, but as we've seen the tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan intensify, I think that we're getting to a point where first of all, there's a likelihood that there could be a conflict. I think that South Asia's next war might be between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And what that could entail is not a conventional war. The Taliban cannot fight the Pakistani military, in my view, but rather Pakistan carrying out strikes in Afghanistan to target terrorists, and then the Taliban sponsoring militant attacks across Pakistan. We saw an attack in Islamabad just a few weeks ago. So I think the concern is that Pakistan could experience what it did some time ago when, between that period of 2007 and 2014, where you had significant numbers of attacks across the country. And that clearly is a concern. Turning to the broader questions that you've asked, including about the U.S. and Pakistan, this is, as you say, this is President Trump, I think, being quite intrigued by Pakistan and what it has to offer. And I think that he personally felt that Pakistan was very helpful when the two countries early on in the second Trump term carried out an operation to apprehend an Islamic State Khorasan fighter that, according to the U.S., was involved in the Abbey Gate bombing in Kabul in 2021. And I think that is where you have to look at why things changed in terms of the more positive thinking from Washington, from the Trump administration about Pakistan. I would also argue that the Pakistanis, not for the first time, were able to pitch themselves to Washington as a viable partner. And Pakistan, I think, knows that, as I said before, this Trump administration takes a very commercial/transactional approach to foreign policy on the whole. It's looking for business opportunities around the world, and Pakistan pitched itself as a useful partner when it comes to issues like critical minerals and cryptocurrency, even though in all reality, it's not going to go very far, in my view. I would say this, though, about how things are looking with the U.S. and Pakistan now. We shouldn't read that much into it. There's been a lot of high-level engagement, of course. There's been a lot of talk about wanting to work together, but there's not much substance to this resurgence in ties. There haven't actually been any agreements. There have been one or two MOUs related to critical minerals. I think that the president could become impatient once he realizes that these commercial opportunities he thinks he has might not actually play out. But, Pakistan is in a tough spot now because it's dealing with this unexpected, what to Pakistan's establishment is an unexpected crisis in ties with the Taliban. Did not expect things to go in that direction. And it's clearly is very concerned about how India has been ramping up its ties with the Taliban. I also don't think we should overstate how far that relationship is going to go. But this is all very concerning for Pakistan. And I would say that my sense is that officials in Pakistan, they're happy with how things are with the U.S. right now. But I think that even they would acknowledge that you don't really know how far this could go. Trump is very unpredictable. What he says today certainly might not be what he wants to say or what he wants to do the next day.
So basically, the future really lies in building a Trump Tower in Rawalpindi, is the obvious solution. But just quickly, Field Marshal Munir, in his speeches talks about that given the problems Pakistan faces with the Baloch rebellion, with a Pashtun or should we say political unrest among the Pashtuns, that the solution for Pakistan is really Pakistan should go back to the two-nation theory, that they should see India as the unifying factor, obviously in a negative way. Do you think that's just rhetoric, or is that something India needs to be worried about?
I mean, I think that all Pakistani army chiefs take a particular view when it comes to these things, including a hardline view. I think that it's rhetoric. One shouldn't necessarily read too much into it. But given the state of play right now, given we know just how fraught the relationship is between Pakistan and India right now. We know how fraught the relationship is between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan is very concerned about these two neighbors. I don't want to say one should be complacent about it, but then again, a lot of things are said, and I think one should not necessarily put too much significance in any one thing that's said at any one time.
Right. So going back to geopolitics, you may have seen Alexander Stubb's article in Foreign Affairs, or the speech he made that was related to it. This is the Finnish president. So he basically said that there's basically a global West, which I presume is mainly the Atlantic relationship and maybe Japan. And then there's now a global East, which is effectively a Russia-China axis or relationship. And then there's the global South, and that the global South is effectively now the swing in global geopolitics. Well, that seems a bit simplistic. I think one of the things that one needs to be looking at now is where does the global South fit in to both the West, or maybe now it's the U.S. and the rest of the West, and then how far can the Russia-China relationship go, given that there are limits, arguably India believes so definitely, to how far Russia would be willing to accept total dependency or dependency on China.
So this is a debate, I think, that goes beyond that article. So John Eikenberry also wrote about this a couple of years ago in International Affairs. Well, this is the piece you're talking about. Perhaps there are two people writing about the same thing. I mean, I think I think we know that things are a lot more complicated, right? India does not fit neatly into a global South category. And I think that India's strength is that it won't be boxed in. It is seeking good relationships on all sides. And I think what's always fascinated me, you know, as someone who's studied Indian foreign policy from even slightly before independence and afterwards, if you move through the motions of non-alignment and then, you know, increasingly into strategic autonomy and now this desire to be a leading power or pole, there is something actually perhaps stabilizing about not taking sides, right? But the moment you take on somebody else's enemy image, maybe the US's enemy image of Russia or of China, you bolster that argument, and in essence, you bolster the risk of conflict. So I think one should, in some ways, be glad that India is not necessarily taking sides. I don't know enough about the Russia-China relationship in detail. I know that it is a concern for India. And I know that this sort of relationship between the three of them really seems to be one of the most important moving forward, and will probably, you know, determine the future of Asia, or the Asia-Pacific, which maybe we'll start talking about now that the Indo-Pacific seems to be being eclipsed from discussion. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, Michael, you might want to comment more on the Russia-China relationship. How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also not an expert on Russia-China, but I'd say that we know that India's government has expressed its opposition to the war in Ukraine. And I would argue that, and I've said this many times before, that Prime Minister Modi has gone further perhaps than any other non-Western leader in publicly expressing opposition to the war, including when Vladimir Putin is sitting next to him, which happened a few years ago. You know, why is India opposed to this war? Why does it want the war to end? One reason is this Russia-China relationship, right? It's the war in Ukraine that's allowed this relationship to take off. I mean, I do agree that you know, you use the word limits. You know, this relationship rhetorically has been described as a no-limits relationship, but I actually think it has a lot of limits, and I think that neither country wants to be dependent on the other. One could argue that Russia wouldn't want to have that full dependency on China, but I'm not sure that China would want Russia to become dependent on it. It wouldn't want that burden, and that would suggest that if this war ends, unfortunately, I'm not optimistic it'll end anytime soon. If it does end, then I think that could have an impact, a negative impact on the Russia-China relationship, though quite frankly, both countries might actually be perfectly okay if they sort of take a step back from each other.
Right. So if you were to, for example, meet Prime Minister Modi a few hours from now, bump into him, and he was to ask you, what do you think India should do in its foreign policy? What would be your response? I'll begin with you.
I think it's imperative to have good relations with China. I think India's played a very strong game of leveraging US concerns about China to build strong relations. But I think what we've seen with Trump's sort of gravitation away from a geopolitical view of the world to a more economics-based transactional one, is that if he sees relations with China in a positive light, then maybe India matters less, certainly in a geopolitical sense. And I think that risk is always there. As I said, this relationship between India, China, Russia, and ultimately between India and China is going to be the most important one in the next however many decades. And as difficult as it may be, I think it's probably the most important one to focus on.
Well, that would require China to definitely be a little bit more generous in its relationship with India, which so far we have zero evidence of, in fact, quite the opposite. China has seen, I would argue, if you look at what they've done, not just in the sense that they did a global ban on critical minerals and rare earths and permanent magnets for everybody. They have not lifted that on India. Just 4 companies got an exemption. But China is now basically telling India, since we weaponize the supply chain, we've got demands on you in terms of actual changing policies that you carry out domestically. So it strikes me that so far China, far from trying to fill in the American space, is trying to say we're just another Trump. So I don't see that playing out right now. This is a really big shift on China. And unlike the United States, at least, they do not claim parts of India and don't kill our soldiers. So at present, I don't see that happening. But anyway, yes.
I think the difficulty is that you can't have an equal relationship with China until you're able to balance China materially, which is why the U.S. relationship has been so useful. So there is that requirement.
So you don't see the possibility of India getting closer to, as it is now, Japan, the EU, Australia, non-West, or even, for example, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so on, that being an alternative to necessarily using the United States?
Does it need to be an alternative to the United States? Absolutely. But I think that will come, and I think it's already very much present and has been built up over the last decade or so. But I still don't think that India can do without as positive a relationship with China as possible.
Okay. So, Michael, what would you be telling Prime Minister Modi?
Yeah, I mean, several points here. One, I think that I would advise him to acknowledge some of the very real concerns that the region, that the neighborhood has about India. That could get me politely shown the door if I were to offer that type of comment. But I think India faces challenges in its own neighborhood, and we've been talking really broad, really global. India's relationships with the big powers, with the U.S., with China, with Russia. But there's a lot that's been happening in this part of the world over the last few years, and I think that if we look at, for example, some of the perceptions that some of India's neighbors, some of its smaller neighbors, I'm not referring to Pakistan here, I'm referring to other countries, have about India. And if one travels around the region, as I have frequently in recent years, talking to interlocutors in Nepal, for example, expressing concerns about China, for sure, but expressing some concerns about India, how it conducts its relations with these countries, perceptions of India not fully acknowledging and being sympathetic to the concerns of these countries. That, I think, is important, given that India already faces significant challenges in the region that are of no fault of its own, quite frankly. But, I think that the neighborhood is important. I think that sometimes commentary about India's neighborhood challenges is exaggerated, quite frankly. There's been discussion about how you have new leaders that are emerging in the region that are more pro-China than pro-India. That's not the case. I think that you have countries in the region, like India, like to balance ties with different powers, right? So you look at Nepal, not Nepal, things have changed there recently. You look at Maldives, you look at Sri Lanka. There have been new leaders that have come into power recently who have telegraphed a desire to strengthen ties with China. But neither the president of Sri Lanka nor Maldives have said that they want to back away from India. In fact, on the contrary, they've said that they consider India to be a close partner. But still, India does face challenges, and I think it's important to acknowledge them all. Other advice I give, which might be received better, is that India clearly wants to project itself as an advocate on behalf of the global South. So does China, of course. This is an element of India-China competition. But I think that India is much more present and influential in some parts of the global south than other parts. And so, for example, Latin America, I think, is an area where India could stand to be more present. And if this is a serious foreign policy objective of the Indian government, which I think it is, I think there's something to be said for looking at the global south in a comprehensive fashion, geographically speaking.
Okay, I think with that, I will bring the session to a close. The world is a big place, and it's a very troubled place, so we could keep finding new things to talk about. But thank you for both of you, and who knows, maybe you will actually get a chance to pass this on to the Prime Minister later in the day. Thank you.